This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with some remarks on Step 2, Assemble Some Evidence. Here's an overview of what we'll cover. First, we'll talk about the analyst's key motivations. Then we'll turn to the analyst's posture. Then we will try to distinguish among three things: information, data, and evidence. And lastly, we'll go over some pointers to bear in mind when you're assembling evidence at this stage of the Eightfold Path. For discussion purposes, we'll think about a specific problem for discussion: too many uninsured motorists. First, let's look at the analyst's key motivations in assembling some evidence. First, the analyst wishes to assess the problem. In assessment, we move beyond defining the problem and think specifically about ascertaining its nature and its extent. Second, we need to think about the problem's context. We're asking, what are the key facts relating to the occurrence and incidence of this problem? And third, we want to make sure to set the policy environment in place. It's rare when we work on a policy problem for the very first time in the history of government. Rather, we want to make sure to sketch in the history, figure out what has been done on this problem in the past. Relative to this problem for discussion, too many uninsured motorists, it may make sense to look at what other jurisdictions may have done, whether they engage in any best practices, or as Bardak calls them, smart practices, as you saw in our reading from his text. We want to look at how they viewed, those other states, they viewed the problem, the incentives of motorists to acquire insurance, the effect of insurance on driving safety, and the like. We can always learn from the analyses conducted in the adoption of programs in other places. Next, let's turn to the analyst's posture. This is the second of 4 items we'll cover as we discuss Step 2 of the Eightfold Path, assembling some evidence. First, it's key that we try to continue to tame the headlines, just as we did when we were defining the problem. We want to make sure that this evidence informs us, since we want to find confirmable facts and sources for that information. Next, we want to approach that process with a gentle sense of doubt. You might think of this as a kind of agnosticism. We don't go in believing specific things about our problem. Rather, we go in assuming that we need to prove whatever we claim, and we need to prove it to folks who are going to doubt our word, and we have to substantiate our claims based upon evidence. Next, we want to make sure we have discriminating eyes and ears, and this is the good kind of discrimination, where we really have an eye towards figuring out what claims are most based on reliable and believable facts. Next, we want to make sure that we remain cognizant that absolute truth and 100% certainty are in fact extraordinarily expensive to come by and are very rare. It's key to remember that the emphasis here is on some evidence. Bardak wants us to assemble enough evidence to become smarter about our problem and move forward to the next steps of the Eightfold Path. The alternatives and criteria specifically are the next steps we will face. We don't need to assemble all the possible evidence, just enough to inform us in sharper terms as we approach the next steps of the Eightfold Path. In terms of the too many uninsured motorists problem that we're considering in this set of remarks, we want to make sure that we look carefully beyond headlines. We want to look at reliable sources of data, perhaps the Center for Disease Control and its look at traffic safety, or other sources of traffic information, the National Highway Administration and other sources that are actually compensated by the public, by the taxpayers, to collect regular information on automotive accidents and perhaps on the state of insurance as to each accident. Moving forward, we want to make sure to distinguish information from data from evidence. Information are simply claims of fact. They're strongly influenced by the purveyors of that information, and they're subject to what you might call the telephone phenomenon. where once a claim of fact is repeated often enough, it may change, and in fact it may go unquestioned, despite the fact that it is nowhere near what the original statement resembled. Information flows according to its conduits and networks, person-to-person connections, and we have to be very mindful that what we're looking for is reliable facts, not just information. And we're going to put those facts towards evidentiary purposes. Let's talk about distinguishing mere information from what we might call data. In its classical form, data is collected according to statistical protocols and regularized surveys. These surveys can be compiled in a series of reads over time. Of course, it doesn't just involve quantitative measures. We can also imagine qualitative information that's systematically collected. The more formalized the data, the more regularized its mode of collection, perhaps the more trustworthy it might be, and the more useful it will be in the policy world in assembling some evidence at this stage of the Eightfold Path. Lastly, evidence is a term reserved for reliable data having probative value involving the specifics of your policy problem. It's important to recognize that evidence is put into a context according to your work as policy analyst. What you consider evidence for any given problem depends entirely upon the purposes of your analysis and where you may be as you iterate through the steps of the Eightfold Path. Also recall at this time, we're talking about some evidence. This evidence might be carefully selected, and we want to always acknowledge that while we have some on hand, we don't have 100% certainty or 100% sum of all of the information and evidence that's possible. Lastly, here are some pointers to bear in mind on assembling some evidence. As you go, make sure to keep a list of your evolving questions and the work you've done to try to answer them. Track your journey, and that will help you keep track of the information you've collected, and it will help you understand which of the facts that you believe to be true are more and less trustworthy, which need further bolstering, or which are actually ready to be used as evidence as is. Beware as you go along that there are many bottomless pits out there. You might find a very promising source that in the end turns out to be not worth the time and effort it will take to figure out what evidence it has to offer. Keep an eye out for these cost-benefit losers when it comes to evidentiary sources in your policy analyses. Make sure to look at prior analysis that you find online, that you find in the library, and exploit those analysts' efforts. If they worked very hard on putting together evidence and they believed it, then you merely need to find out whether it still remains true, whether new data tends to undermine the evidentiary case put forward in those prior analyses or actually strengthen it. We always try to stand on the shoulders of our giant colleagues, the giants in the field, and when we find strong work that has been done, we make the most out of it. As you look for information, find the conduits and the choke points. In the case of automotive safety and uninsured motorists, ask yourself who would know best the number of accidents, the frequency of accidents, the location of these incidents, as well as the state of insurance. And once you piece together what the data collection would look like, namely a police report where there might be a box on the form asking the state of insurance coverage of all of the drivers and the vehicles involved in an incident, you may then have a new strategy on finding where that information will naturally collect and how to best use it as evidence. Also remember that it isn't just about Googling and following things on the internet and looking things up in the library. It's important to remember that phone calls to experts, phone calls to people who are responsible for compiling and maintaining data, can be the most valuable part of your effort at this stage of the Eightfold Path. The holy grail among practitioners of this method is known as the jackpot phone call, where after spinning one's wheels and trying to find information, A lucky phone call reaches a person who can point you in all the right directions. And that is something, when it comes to the assembly of some evidence, that really makes one's day. Well, to review, we've looked at step 2 of the eightfold path, assemble some evidence. We've looked at the analyst's key motivations. We've looked at the analyst's posture. We've distinguished among information, data, and specifically evidence, which is our goal. And then we've gone over some pointers to bear in mind. Throughout the conversation, we've looked at a specific problem only for discussion purposes, the too many uninsured motorists problem. Thank you for your attention. And that's it for assembling some evidence, some brief remarks.